I died the first time in a cold palace wing on a night the snow came down heavy enough to bury the whole world outside my broken window. I was 19, I had entered the palace at 17, made consort at 18, and lost a child I never got to hold before I lost my own life a season later. Nanny Marta pressed a cloth to my mouth to catch the blood I could no longer swallow properly, and told me in a whisper that arrived far too late to matter, that the emperor had never once wanted me for a wife. He had wanted a hostage, a Dragomir daughter close enough to hold my family's salt monopoly hostage, and close enough later to be quietly ruined and used against a regent he feared too much to move against directly. He meant to bind your father's loyalty and unravel Lord Regent Aurel Voinescu's standing in the same stroke, she told me, unwrapping a small oiled paper packet of stolen records with hands as unsteady as my own. You were never the point, my lady, you were only ever the rope. I remember very little of the actual dying, only the particular cruelty of the timing. A child lost to medicine I had trusted because everyone around me had called it a blessing. A title stripped from me within the same season. And a whole capital that had once praised the Yonghouse's daughter for winning an emperor's favor now content to forget I had ever existed at all, once my usefulness to his scheme had run its course. I remember thinking, in whatever thought a dying woman manages to hold on to at the very end, that I had spent my entire brief life being spent by other people's plans and had never once, in 19 years, been asked what I actually wanted for myself. I did not live long enough that first time to understand exactly how the rope was meant to be used against the man I'd never once met. I understood it completely, in the single flooding instant that mattered, the moment I opened my eyes again at 16, 3 days before the summons that would once again try to drag me into that palace. I did not wait for the summons to arrive properly this time. I did not have that much time to spare. Father, I said, finding Marquis Costin Dragomir in his own study before the household had even finished its morning accounts. I need you to arrange my marriage to Lord Regent Aurel Voinescu, and I need it arranged within the week. My father set down his pen slowly, studying me with the particular careful attention of a man deciding whether his daughter had taken ill overnight. The regent, he said. The man half the capital calls cursed, and the other half calls a recluse too strange for decent company. You have never met him, Ileana. What has put this notion in your head so suddenly? A summons is coming, I said. From the palace, within days, if I have not miscounted. I do not intend to be unmarried when it arrives. Father, because an unmarried Dragomir daughter is exactly the hostage His Majesty needs, and a married one is considerably less useful to him. He did not ask that morning how I knew a summons was coming before any messenger had ridden within a day's distance of our gates. He had learned, over 16 years of raising a daughter he'd always found unusually observant, to trust my instincts before he fully understood them, and something in my face that morning apparently convinced him it was not a moment for questions he could ask later instead. My mother, Lady Smeranda, met the news with rather more open alarm than my father's careful composure, wringing her hands over a decision made in the space of a single breakfast rather than the months of careful negotiation a daughter's marriage properly deserved. You have never even seen the man's face, Ileana, she said. What if the rumors are true and he truly is as strange and cursed as the capital claims? Then I will have married a strange, cursed man instead of becoming a dead hostage, Mother, I said more bluntly than I intended, though I did not take the words back. I find, weighing the two fates plainly against each other, that I know precisely which one I would choose again without hesitation. She did not fully understand the certainty behind my words, any more than my father did, but she embraced me tightly before we left, murmuring a blessing over my collar the way she had done every significant morning of my childhood, and I found myself grateful, in a way I had not expected, for a mother's worry that had nothing at all to do with political convenience and everything to do with simple, uncomplicated love. My younger brother Radu, 12 that year, and considerably more interested in his own sword drills than in court politics, asked only with the blunt curiosity of a boy that age whether the cursed regent kept dragons. I very much doubt it, Radu, I told him, though I promise to write and tell you immediately if I discover otherwise. Then it is a rather disappointing marriage, he said with real gravity. But I suppose it will have to do. I laughed, despite the weight of the morning, and held on to that small, ordinary laughter the whole ride to Voinescu's estate, a reminder that whatever danger I was racing to outrun, my family had not yet lost the capacity for simple foolishness in the middle of a crisis, which struck me that particular morning as its own small mercy. Lord Regent Aurel Voinescu received us within the hour of our arrival, which I took correctly as a sign that the capital's rumours about his reclusiveness were considerably exaggerated by people who had simply never given him a reason worth the effort of receiving them. He was younger than the rumours suggested too, sharp-eyed and plainly sceptical of two unannounced visitors arriving with a marriage proposal before proper introductions had even been exchanged. You wish to marry your daughter to a man the court calls cursed for being heirless at 30, he said to my father, though his eyes stayed on me the whole time he spoke, on a single day's notice, with no dowry negotiation, no formal courtship and no explanation beyond urgency. Forgive me if I find the arrangement rather more suspicious than flattering, Marquis Dragomir. The suspicion is fair, I said before my father could answer for me. I will give you the true reason plainly, my lord, though I do not expect you to believe all of it today. His Majesty intends to summon me to the palace within days, to use my family's salt monopoly as leverage against my father, and my presence at court as leverage against you. I would rather marry a man the court calls cursed on a single day's notice, than become a hostage the crown calls blessed. I think of the two insults, yours is considerably the more honest one. Something shifted behind his careful skepticism, not quite belief yet, but the first flicker of a man recognizing that the woman in front of him was not performing desperation for effect. You speak as though you already know precisely what the crown intends, he said. Most petitioners guess. You state it as settled fact. I have very good reason to state it as settled fact, I said. I would rather not spend our first conversation explaining that reason in full, my lord. I would rather spend it arranging a marriage neither of us has time to negotiate slowly. He studied me for a long moment, the particular unhurried assessment of a man who had learned, through years of being underestimated by a court too eager to dismiss him, to look rather harder at people than his reputation for reclusiveness suggested. You understand, he said, that an heirless regent mocked as cursed makes a poor bargain for a marquis's daughter, whatever danger you claim to be fleeing. My own house has no great fortune to offer yours, no grand alliance to sweeten the arrangement. I have only my office, which the crown resents me for holding, and a reputation the capital has spent a decade building against me for reasons that have very little to do with my actual character. I am not marrying your fortune, my lord, I said, nor your reputation. I am marrying a man practical enough to receive two unannounced visitors within the hour, rather than making them wait on ceremony, and sharp enough to ask exactly the right suspicious questions before agreeing to anything at all. I find that considerably better security than any dowry negotiation could offer me. Something in his expression eased fractionally at that, not full trust yet, but the particular loosening of a man who had braced for flattery and received, instead, a plain accounting of his actual merits rather than his rumoured ones. Then I find myself in the unusual position, he said, of being courted for my competence rather than my title. I confess I do not entirely know what to do with the novelty. I believe I will simply agree, and worry about the novelty afterward. My father, watching this whole exchange with the particular relief of a man realizing his daughter's wild morning plan might actually succeed, cleared his throat. Then shall we discuss terms, my lord, or has my daughter already settled those as thoroughly as everything else this morning? Your daughter, Aurel said, with the faintest ghost of what might, in a less guarded man, have been genuine amusement, appears to have settled a great deal more than terms, Marcus. I find I am rather curious to discover what else she has already decided about our marriage before I have had the chance to offer an opinion of my own. He agreed within the hour, though I suspect his own political instincts, sharper than the capital's mockery ever credited him for, did rather more of the convincing than my own urgency managed alone. A Dragomir marriage secured his own standing against a crown that had spent years trying to isolate him through rumor and reclusion. A preemptive match denied the king a hostage he had clearly been counting on. Whatever his private doubts about my strange certainty, the practical case for the marriage needed no further argument. We married within the week in a ceremony so hastily arranged that half the capital's gossips did not learn of it until it was already a settled fact rather than a scandal they might have prevented. My mother, Lady Smiranda, wept through the whole brief ceremony, less from joy than from the particular relief of a woman who understood, without needing the whole explanation, that her daughter had somehow stepped neatly around a danger she'd always privately feared without a name for it. Nanny Marta attended me at the wedding itself, older by 14 years than the version of her I remembered dying beside, and pressed a small dish of salt into my hands before I crossed the threshold of my new husband's house. Salt from my own family's mines. Offered in the old custom alongside bread, the welcome no honest household turned away a true guest. Bread and salt, freely given, cannot be taken back, she told me, the old words steadying something in my chest I had not realized was still shaking. Whatever else this house becomes, my lady, let it at least be an honest welcome. I do not think you have had nearly enough of those in whatever life you are actually remembering. The king's summons arrived 4 days after the wedding, precisely as I had known it would, and found, to the palace messenger's visible discomfort, a married woman rather than an available pawn. Word of my hasty marriage reached the court within the same week, and with it, I learned later, a considerable and entirely justified alarm in certain quarters of the palace that had spent months quietly preparing a scheme my sudden marriage had abruptly rendered useless. Chancellor Grigor Sava, King Petru's own chancellor, and the architect I would come to learn, of considerably more quiet cruelty than his careful public manner ever suggested, visited Voinescu's estate himself within the month, ostensibly to deliver the crown's belated congratulations. His Majesty is disappointed, he said, with a smile that did not reach eyes I already distrusted before I had a single proper reason to. That so distinguished a house arranged its daughter's marriage without troubling to inform the crown first. I am certain no discourtesy was intended. None whatsoever, Chancellor, I said. My father and I simply judged the matter too urgent for the customary formalities. I trust His Majesty understands how quickly some arrangements must move when a house values its daughter's future as highly as ours does. Something flickered behind his composed face, not quite the recognition I'd expect from a man merely disappointed by a missed courtesy, but the particular calculation of someone recalculating a plan he had assumed considerably more time to execute. He left within the hour, and I understood, watching him go, that the danger I had outrun by marrying quickly had not been abandoned. It had only been delayed, and would return in whatever shape a clever chancellor could still make work against a target no longer quite so easy to isolate. I noticed, over the following months, small signs of continued interest from the palace that I might once have dismissed as ordinary court attention. A clerk visiting our estate on unrelated business who lingered rather too long near Aurel's private correspondence. A merchant ostensibly selling fine paper stock who called at our gate twice within a season, asking oddly specific questions about which stationers our household favoured. I mentioned none of it to Aurel immediately, unwilling to raise an alarm I could not yet properly justify, though I found myself watching our own correspondence, rather more carefully than a new bride might otherwise think to. You have grown watchful, Aurel observed one evening, catching me examining a delivered letter seal rather more closely than its contents required. I have grown watchful because I have very good reason to expect Chancellor Sava has not simply given up, I said. A man who spent months preparing one scheme does not abandon the effort merely because a marriage moved faster than he expected. I would rather notice his second attempt before it does damage than be surprised by it the way I was surprised by his first. Then we will watch together, Aurel said, rather than you watching alone. I find I have grown rather fond of not being surprised by things that concern my own household. The king's court tried other pressures in that same watchful year before the forged letter finally surfaced. A sudden, unexplained delay in the crown's usual salt purchases from my father's mines, timed precisely to strain the Dragomir household's finances at a moment convenient to nobody but the palace. A quiet campaign of whispered doubt among the lesser nobility about whether a hastily arranged marriage could really be trusted the way a properly negotiated one might have been. None of it alone amounted to open aggression. All of it, taken together, read like a court testing which pressure might crack a defense that pure decree no longer could. "They are testing which lever moves us," my father wrote, in a letter that reached me the same month the paper merchant made his second unexplained visit to our gate. "I do not think any single lever will succeed, Ileana, but I confess I would rather know what they intend they commit to it fully than continue guessing at shadows." We did not have long to wait for that particular guessing to end. Aurel and I built our marriage slowly, in the practical, careful way two people forced together on a single day's urgent notice must learn to trust each other properly after the fact rather than before it. He was not the cursed recluse the capital's gossip painted him, only a man who had learned, after years of watching the crown try to isolate and discredit him through rumor, that silence and distance cost him far less than performing a warmth the court would only use against him later. "You did not marry me for love," he observed, some months into our marriage, watching me review a dispute among his own tenant farmers with the same careful attention I had once given my father's grain accounts. "I did not," I agreed. "I married you because I had very good reason to believe a crown that wanted to use me as a hostage would find you considerably harder to use me against, once I was actually your wife, rather than merely his subject. I find, though, that I have come to rather like the man I married for such an unromantic reason." "That is not the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," he said, though something in his tone suggested he did not mind the lack of romance nearly as much as the words alone implied. "No," I said, "I find I no longer require romantic reasons for the things that matter most. I require reliable ones. You have not once given me cause to doubt your word in all these months, my lord. I have learned to value that rather more than poetry." He gave me full authority over his own household accounts that same season, an act of trust I understood, from his own steward, Emil's quiet astonishment, to be considerably more significant than it might have looked to an outsider. "I do not trust easily," Aurel told me, placing the estate's ledgers in my hands. "But I have found, in the months since our marriage, that I trust you rather more than I trust most men I have known considerably longer. I would rather you see the whole true shape of this household than any performance of welcome I could offer instead." I learned over that first year the true shape of the curse the capital loved to whisper about, not madness, not any real defect, but the plain, unglamorous fact that his elder brother had died young of a wasting illness the court physicians could never properly name, and that a superstitious capital, unable to blame simple bad luck, had decided instead that some hereditary blight ran through House Voinescu, doomed to leave every heir either dead or childless in turn. Aurel had spent a decade watching potential brides quietly withdraw from every arranged introduction his own relations attempted, until he had simply stopped attempting them at all, retreating into the reclusive reputation the capital had built for him rather than continuing to court a suspicion no amount of good behavior seemed able to unmake. I did not expect a bride to arrive at my gate faster than I could arrange to avoid one. He told me once, with the dry, careful humor I had come to realize he possessed in considerable supply, once a person earned enough trust to see it. I confess I had rather resigned myself to a quiet, unmarried life and a title that would pass sideways to some cousin once I was gone. I find the alternative considerably more interesting, whatever the capital's superstitions might still whisper about it. "The capital's superstitions," I said, "will have rather more trouble whispering about a curse once this house is full of children, my lord. I do not intend to let a decade of idle gossip outlast our actual marriage." He laughed at that, a genuine laugh, the first I had heard from him, and I found, watching his careful composure crack into something unguarded, that I had already begun to want considerably more of that particular sound than I had expected to want anything. This early into a marriage I had arranged chiefly to survive a crown's scheme. The danger Chancellor Sava had merely delayed returned in full the following spring, in the form of a letter that surfaced, with careful, deliberate timing, in the hands of a minor court official who claimed to have discovered it among old chancery records. A letter purportedly written by me to Lord Regent Aurel Voinescu 2 full years before our marriage, discussing, in language damning enough to hang us both, a plot to undermine the Crown's authority in favour of a regency neither of us had ever actually discussed. "I have never written a single word to you before our marriage," I told Aurel, the evening the letter's existence first reached us through a nervous clerk sympathetic to our household. "I did not know your face before the day my father and I rode to your gate. Whoever wrote this letter wrote it in a hand meant to resemble mine, on a date meant to precede a friendship we have never actually had time to build." "I do not doubt you," Aurel said, grim and controlled in a way I had learned, over the past year, meant careful fury rather than calm acceptance. "The question is whether the convocation of peers will doubt it as easily, once Sava presents his forgery with whatever supporting theatre he has clearly spent a year preparing." It was Registrar Nikolai Barbu, an honest keeper of the Royal Chancery's own correspondence archive, who first gave us the thread that would eventually unravel the whole scheme. He came to us quietly, at considerable personal risk, having noticed something in the letter's physical construction that troubled his own professional eye long before anyone asked him to look for it. "The paper is wrong," Nikolai told us, laying the supposedly 2-year-old letter beside a genuine sample of chancery correspondence from the same claimed period. "Look at the watermark in the corner here, against the light. This mark belongs to the Ferraru mill, and the Ferraru mill did not begin producing paper with this particular mark until considerably later than the date written on this letter." "You are certain," Aurel said. "I have handled chancery paper for 30 years, my lord. I do not forget a watermark once I have catalogued it as carefully as I have catalogued every batch this office has purchased in that time. This paper was milled at least 18 months after the date claimed on the letter it carries." We brought the letter to Master Stationer Doriferari himself the following week, under careful pretext, and he confirmed Nikolai's account within minutes of examining the watermark, consulting his own mill's meticulous production ledgers to name the exact season the particular paper batch had first left his workshop. "I would swear to this before the Crown itself," Ferraru said, "if it came to that. A mill's records do not lie about when a mark first entered use, whatever a forger's hand might manage to imitate about the writing itself. It came in the end to precisely that. The convocation of peers was called that summer, the formal assembly of the realm's highest nobility, with the ancient right to sit in judgment over any accusation of treason levelled against one of their own number, a right no king, however displeased, could simply set aside without risking the very foundation of the nobility's loyalty to his throne. Chancellor Sava presented his forged letter with considerable theatrical confidence, laying out a case built on damning language and a signature convincingly close to my own hand. King Petru himself attended, seated above the assembled peers with an expression of careful, practiced concern that I recognized, having watched Chancellor Sava's own composed cruelty for a full year by then, as a mask worn by a man who had learned his performances from considerably more practiced teachers. Nikolai testified first, walking the assembled peers through the watermark's timeline with the same plain clarity he'd shown us privately. Master Ferraru followed, his mill's own dated production ledgers laid open before the convocation, confirming beyond any reasonable dispute that the letter's paper had not existed on the date it claimed to have been written. "A letter written on paper that would not exist for another 18 months, I told the assembled peers, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, "is not evidence of treason, my lords. It is evidence of a forger careless enough to purchase his materials from stock too recent for his own lie to survive scrutiny. I would ask this convocation to consider rather more carefully who benefits from a scandal built on paper that could not have existed." An elder peer, a duke whose own family had sat in judgment at 3 prior convocations across 2 reigns, rose to press the matter further. "Lady Voinescu raises a question this body cannot responsibly ignore," he said. "If this letter is proven false, Someone deliberately constructed a treason where none existed, against two of the realm's own noble houses. I would ask Chancellor Sava directly. From whose office did this letter first emerge? And under whose instruction was it obtained? Sava's composure, already strained by Nikolai's testimony and Fioraru's ledgers, did not survive a direct question posed by a duke with no particular loyalty to protect him. He glanced once toward King Petru, seated above the assembly with an expression I had come to recognize, over that long year, as the practiced mask of a man accustomed to letting others absorb the consequences of his own schemes. Aurel spoke for the first time that day, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent a decade being underestimated and had grown very good, in the meantime, at choosing exactly the right moment to no longer be quiet. I would remind this convocation, he said, that I have held my office through 2 attempts to discredit me by rumor alone, and have never once responded in kind. I do not ask this body to punish a king. I ask only that the peers gathered here recognize a pattern, and record it plainly enough that the next house targeted this way need not build their own defense from nothing, the way my wife was forced to. King Petru's composure held rather longer than Chancellor Sava's did, though it did not survive the full weight of the convocation's own scrutiny once several senior peers began asking, plainly exactly whose interest such a forgery served. Sava, faced with a body of nobles who owed him none of the loyalty he'd counted on from a king alone, broke within the same session, naming His Majesty's own instruction as the scheme's true origin in exchange for whatever leniency his confession might purchase him. The convocation could not, by ancient right and long custom, formally try a reigning king for the scheme his own chancellor had executed on his behalf. What it could do and did was formally censure the crown's conduct before the full assembled nobility, strip Chancellor Sava of every office and privilege he had ever held, and record, in language that would outlast King Petru's own reign considerably, that the Dragomir and Voinescu houses stood entirely cleared of any treason, proven instead to be the targets of a scheme built on materials too recent for the lie they were meant to support. "You have won a legal victory," King Petru told me privately, after the convocation's judgment was formally entered, his composure thin but not entirely broken. "I would remind you, Lady Voinescu, that a crown remembers rather longer than a court record does." "I do not doubt it, Your Majesty," I said. "I would remind you in turn that a convocation's memory outlasts a single king's reign considerably longer than either of ours will. I find I sleep rather more easily trusting that arithmetic than I ever slept trusting your goodwill." He did not have an answer for that, and left the hall without offering one. My father wept openly once the hall had cleared, unashamed for once of a display he would ordinarily have considered beneath his own careful dignity. "I did not fully believe you that first morning," he admitted, "though I trusted you enough to act on it regardless. I do not think I have ever been gladder in my whole life to have trusted a daughter's instinct over my own considerable doubt." "You did not need to fully believe me," I said. "You only needed to act quickly enough that the believing could happen afterward, once there was time for it. I do not think many fathers would have managed even that much, father, whatever doubts sat underneath it." My mother, less composed but no less proud, embraced me tightly enough to rival Radu's own enthusiastic congratulations, which arrived considerably less formally, in the shape of my younger brother loudly informing the entire assembled court that his sister had beaten a whole chancellor and nearly a king, and still found time to write me letters about it. A boast he apparently repeated to anyone who would listen for a full month afterward. I told Aurel I carried our first children on an ordinary evening some months after the convocation's judgment, watching his careful composure crack entirely, for only the second time in our whole marriage, into something unguarded and genuinely disbelieving. "The physician says twins," I told him, which I understand the capital's old superstitions would once have called some further evidence of a curse, rather than the plain, ordinary blessing it actually is. "Let the capital call it whatever foolishness it likes," he said, holding both my hands with a gentleness I had rarely seen from a man the court had once painted as cold and cursed in the same rumor. "I did not expect to want this quite as much as I apparently do, Ileana. I confess a decade of being told I would never father an heir left me rather better prepared to be disappointed than to be this thoroughly, unreasonably happy. Then let us be unreasonably happy together, I said, and let the capital's revised gossip catch up to the truth whenever it finally manages to. We had 5 children in the years that followed, twins first, born within the same hour and loud enough that Steward Emil declared the household properly under siege before the midwife had finished her work, and 3 more some years later, close enough in age that the nursery staff never fully agreed on whose turn it truly was to referee which dispute. The capital, which had once called Aurel cursed and heirless and unfit for decent company, found itself obliged to quietly revise an entire decade's worth of gossip once the household's 5th child arrived healthy and loud into a home the same gossips now called, with considerably less irony, remarkably blessed. I find I do not mind the earlier insults nearly as much now that they've had to eat every one of them. Aurel told me once, watching our eldest twin attempt to teach the youngest of the 5 an entirely invented and extremely complicated game involving the household's good silverware. I never much minded them either, I said, since I married you for reasons rather sturdier than what the capital happened to think of you at the time. I find their revised opinion pleasant, but I would have been equally content raising 5 children in a house, the whole capital still called cursed, so long as the household itself never once believed it. Our eldest twin, a son we named for my own father, grew into precisely the sort of watchful, careful boy his father had once been at the same age, and made a habit by 7 of quietly correcting Steward Emil's household tallies with a bluntness that made Aurel laugh outright at the sheer, unimprovable resemblance. His twin sister, louder and considerably more inclined toward mischief, discovered early that the estate's tallest oak made for excellent climbing practice, a discovery that cost the household several torn dresses and precisely one memorable afternoon when Aurel himself had to be talked out of climbing up after her, on the grounds that a regent stuck in a tree would do rather less for the family's revised reputation than a daughter who could climb down perfectly well on her own. Our 3rd child, born some years after the twins, took after Nanny Marta more than either of her parents, following the old woman through the household's kitchens and still rooms with rapt attention, learning the proper way to offer bread and salt to a guest before she could properly pronounce either word, and announcing at 5, with total seriousness, that she intended to be the one who remembers the old customs when Nanny Marta gets too old to remind everyone herself. Our 4th, a son with his mother's bluntness and his father's patience in roughly equal measure, took to asking Registrar Nicolai on his occasional visits endless detailed questions about watermarks and paper stock, until the old registrar declared with real if reluctant pride that he had accidentally trained an apprentice several decades before the boy would be old enough to properly serve as one. Our youngest, born nearly a decade after the twins, and cherished all the more fiercely for arriving so much later than anyone had planned for, grew up in a household so thoroughly recovered from its old reputation that she found the stories of her father's supposed curse almost impossible to credit, and spent one memorable summer interviewing every servant in the house, individually, about whether it was actually true, or just something Papa says, to make the old gossips sound silly. Steward Emil, by then quite grey himself, answered her question with such a long and detailed account of the actual decade of rumour that the child emerged from the conversations, both thoroughly convinced and thoroughly outraged on her father's behalf, and did not let the subject drop for weeks. We marked 20 years of marriage with a gathering at the Voinescu estate, considerably larger than the hasty, single-witness wedding that had begun it. My parents grown properly old by then, Radu arrived with a wife and children of his own. Registrar Nicolai and Master Firaru both invited as honoured guests rather than mere witnesses to a legal proceeding, and Nanny Marta, ancient but sharp-eyed still, seated at the place of honour she had earned 100 times over across 2 entire lifetimes of service. I did not expect 20 years ago watching you ride out on a single day's notice to marry a stranger the whole capital called cursed, my father said, raising his cup with a steadiness that still occasionally surprised me in a man who had wept so openly at the convocation's judgment, that I would live to see this particular stranger's house filled with quite so much noise. nor quite so much love. I find myself considerably prouder of my daughter's instincts than I have ever been of my own careful planning. Aurel never won for long speeches even after 2 decades of marriage, simply raised his own cup and said, to a bride who arrived faster than I could arrange to avoid one. I have not once regretted the speed of it. Nanny Marta lived long enough to see all 5 children through their own naming days, and made a standing habit, every single visit, of pressing a fresh dish of salt from the Dragomir mines into whichever child was old enough that year to properly understand the old custom, repeating the same words she had once given me at my own threshold. Bread and salt, freely given, cannot be taken back, she told my eldest daughter once, watching the girl solemnly accept the dish with far more ceremony than a child her age typically managed for anything. Remember that, child, when you are grown and someone offers you a welcome that costs rather more than it appears to. King Petru died some 8 years after the convocation's judgment, and his successor, a nephew rather more interested in stable trade routes than in old grudges against houses, too troublesome to move against openly, restored the crown salt purchases from my father's mines within the first season of his reign, along with a formal, if quietly worded, acknowledgement that the realm's peers had judged the prior scheme fairly. I did not gloat over the old king's passing, though I confess I did not mourn it especially either. I had by then built rather too full a life of my own to spend much of it measuring satisfaction against a dead man's failures. Registrar Nicolai retired at last in his 70s, having trained, as it happened, 2 apprentices in his final years rather than the one he'd originally intended, our 4th child among them, formally indentured to the Chancery Archive at 16 with his parents' considerable pride and Nicolai's own gruff, delighted approval. Some skills, the old registrar told me once, watching the boy carefully catalogue a watermark with exactly the same patient attention Nicolai himself had once brought to unravelling a forgery that could have hanged us both, are better passed on deliberately than left to be rediscovered by the next family unlucky enough to need them. I still keep a small dish of that same salt on my own table, refilled each year from my family's own mines. And I have found, in all the years since a king's summons found a married woman instead of an available hostage, that the old custom has never once failed to mean exactly what it always promised. Bread and salt, freely given, cannot be taken back. I built an entire second life on the certainty of that promise, and I have never once regretted trusting it over whatever glittering, hollow welcome a palace once tried to offer me instead.